There we go. Okay.
Hi, Jess. So we've agreed today to look at the first three modes in the Hawkins and Shohet model, and to discuss that and then share it with the class if we're happy with it subsequently. Is that okay with you? Are we still
Yes.
on for that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay. Okay, and there might be other things, in terms of the surrounding sort of context of the Hawkins and Shohet model we might want to sort of touch into as well. So just to acknowledge that really, that the book has been reprinted 5 times, hasn't it? Or rather 5 editions, which is slightly different to reprints because editions means that various sort of changes have been made over the years. So just to acknowledge that as well about the model, although fundamentally I think the modes remain pretty similar.
Yeah, I think so. I think the changes that I've noticed, so I've got the 5th edition here with me, and I think it's there's a little bit more on working with difference. It's been sort of updated in terms of what's topical in the thinking around supervision and generally therapy work at the moment, I think.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that in the sort of 7th mode, about the environment, comments about the environment. In the original editions, it was more on the organizational context, whereas they've really broadened that. Now, I know we're not talking about that in this session, but just to acknowledge that they do now acknowledge the environment and ecological, economic side of things, and so on. So it really is much broader.
The seventh eye is really big. It
Yeah,
takes a really big view.
yeah, a bit like standing outside the planet and
Yeah.
looking at the planet now.
Yes.
And in fact, I had a vision when I was thinking about the model, thinking about the class, of putting that you've got this what they originally called the double matrix, where okay, we're teaching supervision, but clearly that's the helping professional, as it were, whether that's a nurse or a therapist or an OT, is working with, let's just call them the patient. And in the first 3 modes, which is what we're looking at today, is we're really focusing on that kind of helping patient relationship. So the supervisor kind of almost sits out of that, but is talking to the supervisee about their relationship with the patient and how all that is going. Yeah. Anything else you want to say about that side of the sort of matrix, as it were, that first?
Yeah, I think something that's come up for people when they look at that matrix, which we could mention now perhaps, is that sense of hierarchy. That the way it's drawn is in a hierarchical way, in that the patient, if we're calling it patient, is at the bottom, and you work upwards. So the supervisor is above the professional supervisor, and it goes on up. And actually, it's not really like that. It's not hierarchical in the sense of there is an element of power there. Of course there is, which shouldn't be ignored. But I like to sort of turn it on its side and just see it as a sort of
continuum sort of thing.
Yeah, interlinking chains. There are connections between everything, and then the connections, of course, also loop around. So it's actually a much more complex diagram if you wanted to draw in all the different connections.
Yeah, or actually, as you said that, you could sort of turn the diagram on its side, or you could turn it on its head, couldn't you, where the patient, the citizen, is at the top, and
absolutely.
the individual versus the world at the bottom, sort of thing.
Exactly, because actually everything that everyone is doing in this whole system here is, or should be, for the benefit of the patient. Ultimately, that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yes, but it also acknowledges that everybody interconnects,
Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
it? So that's the whole interconnection, really interdependence of humanity and the environment at the end of the day.
Yes.
But okay, philosophical. Let's come back to the beginnings. I always want to call them stages, but they're modes. So the beginning, the first mode, which is focused on the patient and how they present and how they come into the room. And I think, you know, from my mind, every time we think about this or we talk about the people that we work with, it's easy to talk about them without really giving a clear sense of sort of who they actually are, you know, and yet the minute somebody says something, you know, about sort of like how they're dressed or how they say something, you get a sense, you begin to get a flavor.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and really important thing to bring in, because for two reasons. One is that the people we're working with are human beings first and foremost. And when you are only thinking of one aspect, if you're just thinking about the problems they're bringing, you're not seeing the whole person. And every human being is much more than the problem that they're bringing. And the other thing is that we communicate so much non-verbally. So the way someone presents in terms of their body language is just as important as what they say to you.
Mm.
And yeah, that is something that often doesn't come in, because you may be focused on the problem, you're focused on what they said. Actually, how they looked, how they dressed, how they walked into the room, if you saw them in person, all those things convey so much. So I think I remember, Amelia, one of the things exercise you did was you suggested that we really focus on how somebody looked when they came in, describe them, so we can have to your supervisor, describe them so you have a really clear visual image, and not only of what their hair color is and those things, but also how they moved, how did they sit in the chair, all those things which tell us so much about their inner state.
Yeah, yeah. And I used to say things like, well, how do they knock on the door?
Yes.
And these days, and it's always surprises me how people do knock on the door, because people you expect to have quite loud knocks often have quite quiet ones, and vice versa. But these days it's, well, how do they, you know, when we're doing online work, how do they come online? You know, what's going on in the background, you know? How are they looking? Are they kind of looking surprised? Are they all dead organized? What's going on? You know, so that you, again, that can just give you a flavor, can't it, straight away, really, of where the person is as they metaphorically enter the room.
Yeah. Yes. I think there's a whole nother level now, isn't there, working online, but you can still gain an awful lot of knowledge from that presentation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, and it sort of makes me think too of what's sort of not online, so what we're not seeing, and sometimes we can be surprised by that. I mean, the obvious things are like pets walking across the screen, which I kind of quite enjoy. But there can be other things where you might get a sense of somebody else being in the room and how that might affect things and so on, you know, in relation to that. But I think it's all about, isn't it, getting people to be as accurate as they can in how they convey the patient or the client, the helpee, into the room with the supervision. How do they convey that?
Yeah.
You know, and what used to happen when I was nursing on wards sometimes is, you know, you might be in the office and another nurse was out on the ward, and I'll never forget that there were a couple of nurses who'd come back and kind of say how the patient had said something in exactly the same tone of voice. And it was quite eerie how they would sort of convey, oh, John says he wants this, and they'd sort of put it in exactly the way that John had said, a sort of an eerie accuracy. And you really got the sense of how John was feeling at the time, what sort of a mood John was in. You know, so on the one hand, you can think when people sort of almost imitate how somebody comes across, is that being respectful? You know, On another hand, though, when people are conveying that, it would give me, in some cases, a very sharp sense of how the patient was before I even walked out the door to see the patient. Don't know if you've got anything more to say on mode one in relation to the work with our goal, I think, is definitely to get an accurate view from the supervision point of view, from the supervisor's point of view, is to get an accurate view of the client and help the therapist to really pay attention to that.
Yes, exactly. I think that was the aspect I was going to highlight, that obviously it's helpful as a supervisor to get as clear a picture as possible of the person that the supervisee is working with, but also inviting that encourages the supervisee to really pay attention in a way they might not otherwise, and they might actually notice things that they had overlooked, in having to tell you more about how that person presented. Things might come up, and I think it's really helpful to pay attention to that. What they may say, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but when they came in, they were shoulders hunched or whatever, something.
Yeah.
So I think that can be a really helpful conversation to have.
Yes, and in supervision, I will say sometimes, just sit in the same posture that you see your client as sitting in. Yeah. And even just sitting there and being in that posture, isn't it, can give that, you can just get into the feeling, really. And speculate on how it might be for the other person. Okay. Well, so we're thinking about sort of mode 2 then, which is around the strategies and interventions used by the therapist. And in this case, and the helper, I think in this case, sometimes helpers can be a bit over obsessed on this. What do you think?
I think we tend to be quite self-critical.
Yeah.
Particularly if something is hard, if it's not going the way you want it to go. I think we tend to come in with the attitude that, oh, well, if only I'd done this, that, or the other, if I'd tried this or tried that. I think that brings a lot of information. So sometimes the information that can be bringing is that, this is someone who is feeling responsible for changing everything, rather than viewing it as a collaboration between professional and patient. The patient has some responsibility also. That's perhaps more pertinent to therapy work, but I think there's some of that. We are we do take on the burden of being responsible for everything. Sometimes it could be quite helpful to say, well, what's the other part of this partnership doing?
Yeah, no, I think that's very topical in relation to health too, when I think we are seeing an overall shifting of responsibility where it has been very medical focused, that people are beginning to see the merits of taking back some responsibility for looking after their own health. And so, as you say, it ought to be a collaborative affair. Sometimes it can be a conflicting affair. But there is something, isn't there, about making choices in that. So by giving the patient a voice in that from the supervisee's point of view, and perhaps even talking about which sort of interventions they're going to use and why, or they're thinking about using. But yeah, I mean, overall, the goal here is also to extend the repertoire of the supervisee in working with the patient in that sense, that they may have some standard strategies and moving away from like always doing the same thing, having a bit more flexibility in the use of their skills and strategies, working with, well, what are the alternatives and should we think about that?
So there's an educative element here that may come in, And as we said before we started, particularly in the earlier stages of someone's career, yeah, to push, to challenge a little bit gently, to encourage to go a little bit beyond the safe, the normal, the usual interventions, and try something a bit different, maybe.
Yes. Yes. So I think on the one hand, we don't want our supervisees to be sort of over obsessed with, did I do it right? But to have enough reflective ability to be able to kind of reflect on it and consider alternatives, but not in some kind of a self-flagellating manner.
Yeah, yes, constructively. And I like the element that you brought in of always, when you're brainstorming ideas, always bring in at least one crazy one totally bizarre and off the wall one. I think again that playful, creative element can be really helpful. You may not end up doing the crazy one, but it may open up some other ideas or other possibilities, or even just a different sort of approach to trying one of the other interventions that you're considering.
Yeah, absolutely, actually. And I mean that makes me think of the mode 3, the relationship that's going on between the supervisee and the person that they're working with. You know, and that sort of crazy idea of what song is left on my brain, because that quite often happens, is I'll have a song on my brain at the end of the session. So that the sort of the unconscious, you know, what's going on that you suddenly thinking, you know, you've got ABBA, The Name of the Game, on the end of the session or something like that, you know, what's going on.
Yeah, well, I think it's always really important to listen to those strange things that pop into your head. So often it's your unconscious giving you some information that is very helpful.
So how do we understand that stage, that mode 3 of the Hawkins and Shohet model? How do you sort of, so we're looking really now, focusing on the helping relationship.
So I think it's really important to be able to sort of step outside of yourself and observe that relationship. So because when we're in a relationship, we're very involved in what's going on, in what we're inputting into it. You have to make a deliberate effort to actually step outside that and just observe it as if it's somebody else. But I think unless you do that, it's very hard to see what's going on. You need that perspective.
Yeah, and I'd almost add to that as a kind of a bit like a pendulum swinging, really, that in some ways I have to get a bit lost in the relationship in order to pop out, you know. So I might suddenly find myself feeling maybe a bit cross, or you know, so if I'm working directly now with a patient or something, so I'm kind of caught in something. Like, I wasn't feeling cross before we met. Why am I feeling cross now, sort of thing? So I need to sort of be cross first in order to then do what you're saying, is stepping out and say, hang on, what's going on? Why are you suddenly feeling cross now? What's just happened?
Yes.
But I've got to do it first in order to then step back.
Yes, so you have to be almost in two, well, you say pendulum, yes, or sort of in two places at once, really.
Yeah.
So you have to be fully involved, engaged in the relationship, but you also have to have a little bit of your brain observing that engagement. And reflecting on it as you go. I think what you said there about, oh, I wasn't feeling like that when I came in, that reminds me of one of the most useful things that my supervisor told me, and it applies also to therapy. So in terms of recognizing transference and countertransference, she said, so before you start a session, whether it's with a supervisee or with a patient client, just check in with yourself. How am I feeling today? What mood am I in? How's my body feeling? Am I relaxed? Am I tense? Have I got something on my mind? Is there something going on in the back of my head? What images have popped into my head today? Just do a check-in so you know what's there, how you're feeling. And then in the session, anything that comes up that's different is almost certainly a result of what's going on in that session, or is is transference or countertransference or parallel process, something that's coming up from the unconscious. I found that very helpful, just to sort of check in with myself before I start a session, so I know what comes up in the session.
And how you're impacted by somebody, really, isn't it? That exactly. We've had a sort of mindful few minutes really before that session, so it's so important, isn't it, and respectful to sort of clear a bit of a thinking space and a being with oneself space, so that we can really be fully present with the other when we actually then engage into the session.
Yes.
So it's a sort of discipline then, and then we've got that sort of not exactly blank sheet, but a sort of that sort of available space. We know what's in it, even if I'm still worrying about the bathroom leaking and I haven't got a plumber yet. That that I know that that's going on in a corner of the mind, but there's also, that sort of space available for the person.
Yes, and I think it also just helps to clarify. I find it helps to clarify for me, because however well we know ourselves, things can still pop up that surprise us, so unexpected. We have so much material that we carry unconsciously, and sometimes it can be hard to tease out, what is mine, what is theirs. So it's helpful if you have cleared that space before you start, and you know what's in the background, what's in the lumber room. Then you can be more aware of what's coming up and where it's coming from.
And they said, Hawkins, Shohet, the idea of getting a metaphor, an image of the relationship, so that when we speak to the supervisor, what's their image of the relationship that they would have with the patient, what's the kind of symbol, or if it was a car, what kind of car would they be? Sometimes you might say, well, what kind of a car would the patient be? What kind of car would you be, and where are you? But there's different ways of getting at sort of metaphors for the relationship.
Yes, and yes, again, one of those exercises that you have set the group, the supervision training group, is to draw yourself and your patient client as animals. What animals would you be? That can be very revealing.
Yeah.
Are you the big scary fish waiting to jump out and swallow the little fish?
Or the little bit of rock that the fish swims around. Are you the little sort of safe haven that they can swim into whilst the big predators are out there? Where are you? What kind of, are you in like a little gentle pond? Are you in the big wide ocean? So where are you together? Well, sometimes they'd sort of say things like, if you were sitting next to the person on a plane, how would you feel? And what would that seem like? So that we can explore all elements of the relationship, including the ones that one feels more cautious about or concerned about. Could I really sit next to this person on a 3-hour flight to southern Spain or something? Would I want to escape? And so on. So it's kind of really thinking quite frankly about that relationship in order to understand where the sort of weak spots are, the places of caution where one might feel a little bit in danger, even depending on the sort of the nature of the health work that we're doing.
I think that's a very good point, is about bringing out the more uncomfortable aspects of the relationship, and that's harder. obviously harder to share. So relies on there being a good relationship between supervisor and supervisee, trust there, trust in the non-judgmental approach of the supervisor. And I think it can be easier to share these things if they're shared through metaphor or through drawing, or so much easier to draw something and then talk about that drawing than to talk about it directly.
Yeah.
That can be a way to make it a gentler process for the supervisee to examine those more difficult aspects of the relationship with their patient.
Yes, and I think of it sometimes as a way of bypassing the intellect.
Yeah.
Or my judge who sits in the chair. You know, sometimes I've got to bypass that, because otherwise I'm not gonna be as honest as I need to be about it. But also there's the transferential nature, isn't there, which you've mentioned, you know, the words transference and countertransference. So thinking about transference, and what do we actually mean by that?
So I think about transference as, so if I'm in the room, let's say with my supervisee, my supervisee may see me as me, or they may see me through a lens of material that belongs to their own past, their own history. So they may see me through the lens of somebody else that they've known in the past, that they've had a powerful relationship with. And they will expect me, at some unconscious level, they will expect me to behave and respond in the same way as that person from their past. I think it's that is, for me, that's how I would think of transference, that they are almost putting like a mask over me, and they're seeing me, but they're also seeing unconsciously this person from their past, and they are transferring their own emotions around that relationship onto this relationship that we have in the here and now.
Yeah. And I think when we're sort of working with our supervisees to sort of help them to understand what transference the patients might be sort of putting into that relationship, you know, often as a health professional of various kinds, they're in a position of authority. So the transference is usually, about a past experience, often a parent, but sometimes a significant teacher. I was someone's piano teacher one time. Not all good, I can tell you.
Well, that sounds quite scary to me.
Yeah. And but at least we were able to tease that out, so it's kind of like an authority figure, and then their expectation. I remember another time where I had somebody would come in. They were always on time, but they'd apologize for being late. And I hope you're not going to tell me off. I hope you're not going to tell me off. And I would sort of think, well, I wasn't feeling like telling you off. But we realized, that obviously they did get told off a lot. And we're trying to sort of sort that out, take some control over it. But of course, I ironically found myself feeling a bit cross, thinking, well, I wasn't going to tell you off, but now I feel quite cross with you.
So is that where we come into countertransference, would you say?
Oh, right. Yes, go on. Yes, absolutely. Go on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose I'm talking about the sort of the mask that
Yes.
the other person puts on you.
Yes.
Which is a mask that comes from somewhere in their own past. And I suppose I think of countertransference as the mask that we bring up from something from our past, and we stick on the other person, or it's how we respond to their transference.
Yeah.
Which connects with our own stuff.
Yeah, so exactly the sort of thing that you sort of commented on mine, that was my countertransferential reaction, wasn't it? That I was suddenly put in the position of somebody, a finger wagging person who was going to tell them off. And as a result, I felt quite cross about that, and a bit powerless in that sense. So it kind of I think, caught a bit of them in terms of their relationship and feeling powerless, perhaps with the person, and also my genuine response, which was provoked by that sort of thing. So it was a direct response to their sort of putting that hat and coat on me, and then me reacting accordingly.
So it can be quite difficult to tease that out, really, because it is a bit of their stuff and a bit of our stuff. So it can be hard to sort of unstick.
Yeah.
I'm imagining Velcro now, like that. And you want to actually tear it apart and say, all right, this is what this is made up of.
Yeah. And yeah, it just makes me think there that we can again, the thing about getting caught up in something, so that I get caught, and sometimes I tell myself off for getting caught, but actually it is in that getting caught that can be quite revealing. But the issue then is not necessarily, sort of acting into the getting caught. So in other words, I feel cross because I'm being made out to be this finger wagging, telly-offy sort of person. But if I can just put that aside and observe that, ideally in the moment, sometimes you won't always catch it in the moment. I often catch myself outside of the session and then having to come back. I'm often not quick enough to get it in the moment, but I usually am able to reflect on myself getting caught and then offering it back in a bit later and exploring that further with the individual.
So I guess the key points here are honesty and sort of suspending your own judgmental attitude to yourself, and being able to step back and observe what's happening in a non-judgmental way, and then bring it into the session.
That's right. Yes, and I think the other thing that Hawkins and Shohet mentioned in relation to sort of developmental stages of the individual in supervision was that you start off being quite self-focused. Can I make it in this work? How am I doing? A little bit over self-conscious, maybe, that sort of thing, but natural part of that stage. Then a sort of a kind of client-focused, sort of very much focused on, can we work together, before we then move into the process, just as we've begun to talk now about the sort of the transferential stages. So to be able to then stand outside of oneself and look at the me-you in this relationship, and started off, I mean, I always needed the help of supervision to do that, before I was able to sort of develop that skill for myself, sort of thing. And even now, you can still get caught in things, and not always catch yourself in that sense. Somebody else might need to catch you before you fall.
Absolutely. I think that's where having that other person in the room to observe the relationship from outside is so helpful.
So do you think that's enough for now?
Yes, I think there's a lot more to say about all the unconscious processes, but I think a lot of that belongs to the 4th, 5th, and 6th eyes of the model.
I mean, feel free to say anything further about the 3rd eye that might be occurring to you in terms of that relationship.
Yeah, I think the only thing that popped up for me, which probably we'll talk more about when we get onto the other modes, is the strength of emotion that comes with unconscious processes, and that can be, you talked a little bit about how you sort of, what flags up the fact that there is transference or counter-transference going on, and sometimes it's feeling something that you just hadn't been feeling before, but also I think it can be when there is a disproportionate amount of emotion appearing in response to something. So I think that can, and perhaps in our next talk I'll share a personal story which really drove that home to me, but I'll save that for the next time.
Oh, right. You're dangling a carrot there. But yes, I mean, the other sort of metaphor that I was thinking of there is the 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, the idea of the 1 foot in, as Rogers said. And something about, yeah, you know, we can then, if we're too far in, you know, we may end up in the pit with the person. Or if the other indication for me is if I am totally unmoved, if I really sort of don't feel anything, and I've seen the person on a few occasions, there may be something for me there as well, in terms of, you know, how come that, like, you're not moved at all by this person.
Something that's blocking you from accessing those emotions that you'd expect to be there, that some kind of defense or resistance.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's stop there in terms of the video. Mm-hmm. 11, 12, we're on.